The Publishers for Development meeting this year is scheduled so that it's right before IFLA. So if people are going to IFLA in France, it's very easy to just stop off in London for a day for the meeting. Last year it was scheduled right after Frankfurt. So they do try to do it to make it easy for us.
And it's in Oxford this year.
In Oxford this year, which these publishers love. So now we're ready for questions and answers. I thought it was important to leave a lot of time. I've got some prepared questions that they're ready for, but if you want to go, let's go. Yeah?
It's fascinating to see the different projects going on. What I don't understand is what's the distinction between INASP and Research for Life, and why is it the case that there are two different bodies?
Well, one thing I can say is that Project Muse is a humanities publisher. We don't really fit into the Research for Life group. We don't save lives with Byron studies. But I'll let Richard answer that one.
I didn't quite hear your question, but did I understand?
The question is, why are there two different organizations? Why is Research for Life doing its thing and INASP does a different thing? And what's the overlap and the difference?
Yeah, I think there are all sorts of historical reasons, I think, why there are two organisations, and in fact there are at least three, because there's IFL as well. I think over the course of the last few years, INASP and Research for Life have got a lot closer together, and myself and Lucy Browse at INASP and Sue Corbett, who is the Chief Executive of INASP, have had lots of meetings and conversations, some of which have really been designed to try to work out ourselves where we both respectively fit into the sort of continuum that is publishers working, outreaching to the developing world. And I think, and in fact we are actually working together on a number of things now. We have a joint training initiative in Sierra Leone, which took place, the first bit of it, which took place earlier this year, and our trainer Lenny Ryan and their training organiser Anne Powell have been working together on that with a local Sierra Leonean trainer as well, and there's probably a lot more I could say about that. But I think one of the things I think that differentiates Research for Life and INASP is the element of what you get, how complicated it is, to what extent it's tailorable. To some extent, Research for Life, you take it or leave it, it's a library in a box. INASP is very much a case of saying, well, actually, this is what we'd like, and can we negotiate with the relevant suppliers for this? And I think there's a place for both. If you are, if as a institution or a country you have very little information capacity, then it's actually probably easier just to go with what you can get easily through Research for Life. It doesn't cost anything, there's no negotiations or anything like that. It's also the case that it's likely that if your capacity in this area is very low, you don't have fixed IP ranges, and of course that makes it very difficult to enter into any kind of engagement with publishers as you would through INASP, where you can only get access if by IP recognition. One of the things that Research for Life offers publishers is that it will validate institutions who apply for access, and it will issue usernames and passwords which allow access then to be diverted through a proxy server in Geneva at the World Health Organization. Now that means that you can have access to a username and password without the same sort of concern that publishers might have about this being misused. Research for Life keeps very, very close tabs on that sort of thing. So there are all sorts of reasons why in certain instances Research for Life gives you a hell of a lot of content, but you don't have to sort of do too much in order to negotiate your way around getting to it. It also means that because it's a single sign-on with a single username and password, and then once you get within that walled garden, you don't have to worry about anymore. I mean, if you have no fixed IP addresses and you have, say, 20 different relationships with 20 different publishers, all of whom have have usernames and passwords, you do a PubMed search or a Google Scholar search, come up with 20 responses, that's 20 different usernames and passwords you've got to remember. So it's actually very good in that sort of instance. If, on the other hand, you have developed a little bit further along the spectrum, you've got somewhat more sophisticated capacity and would like to say, look, actually, Research for Life is great, but we actually would like to engage more directly with publishers about what we get and the services we get with it, then INASP is actually a very good next step, because what INASP does, one of the things INASP does, is actually provide you with negotiating expertise. That whatever your capacity is, it's quite likely that it won't include detailed knowledge and expertise in negotiating with these nasty Northern Hemisphere publishers. Sorry, I said metaphorically speaking. And INASP has the expertise to do that on your behalf. And indeed, one of the things that INASP does is engage in negotiation training. Last year, INASP invited a group of, I think it was about a dozen librarians, 2 from each of 6 countries, to a course in Oxford, where they learnt a bit about the whole business of negotiating for subscription access. So there is there are clear differences between us, but there are also ways in which we can cooperate and collaborate, and indeed we have been doing.
Can I just clarify, so when you have a username and password, that's for an individual person?
No. The Research for Life usernames and passwords are institution-based. So the way it works is that an institution in a Research for Life eligible country, if it isn't already a registered institution for Research for Life, will complete an online form giving details about themselves and a library contact and a technical contact and a sort of director contact. That will then go to the experts at WHO for Hinari, FAO for Agora, and so on and so forth. It's then shared with the relevant regional office for that country, who will be able to know whether the institution really does exist and is a proper organisation. Once that's all been cleared, a single username and password is issued for that institution, and the librarians are encouraged to share it with as many people as possible, but obviously not to put it up on public websites or whatever. So it's a single password per programme, per institution.
Question? Yeah.
Is participation in Research for Life, strictly based on country level, or is it down to a smaller, even institutional level based on need and ability to pay? As somebody pointed out, there is, even within countries, wide disparity. So I was just wondering if it's possible to break that down.
So the question is whether participation in Research for Life is country level, or whether it's at a more granular level, like North or South, or the rich private institutions and the poor public ones, for example.
That's an interesting question, and the answer is both, actually, depending on which way you look at it. Eligibility country eligibility for participation in Research for Life is based at country level, and it is done basically on a GNI per capita basis. And if you go above that threshold, you don't qualify. If you go below a threshold, you do qualify. And if you go below another threshold, you qualify for the free access rather than the $1,000 access. So to that extent, it's country based. Having said that, it's clearly the case that as publishers we vary enormously in terms of what our sort of priorities are for market development, what our sort of resources are for dealing directly in certain countries. And so right from the start, Research for Life has said, look, if you become a publisher partner in Research for Life, while we encourage you to make your content available to every country, particularly the lowest, the poorest, we recognise that some publishers, particularly the larger ones, will have their own salespeople, their own networks and such like in certain countries, so you can opt to exclude those if you want to. Now that's a fairly blunt instrument, of course, because you may opt to exclude a whole country because you have a good consortial deal with the 6 top research-intensive universities in that country. So you exclude that country, so all the little community colleges and such like are also excluded. And we are actually now working on making our institution base within each country a lot more granular. We started off last year by classifying institutions in a 7-fold way: higher education, hospitals, government departments, local NGOs, and so on and so forth. And as of 2014, we have said you can exclude at that category level if you want to, and our colleagues at Elsevier are trialling out that functionality this year. Now, that isn't as far as we intend to go, because at the moment, Alicia, if she wants to, can choose to exclude higher education but include hospitals. What we're working towards, and we hope to have this ready by next year, is that it'll be possible to break down our 2 major categories of institution, which is higher education and hospitals, into 2 subcategories, so that HE will become research-intensive universities rather as against teaching-based, teaching-intensive universities, and hospitals will be teaching hospitals versus community health centres, so that it'll be possible to say, protect your major deals with the big research-intensive universities, but not disenfranchise the community colleges, which you would probably never do business with anyway. And we're hoping to be able to, we've got a very, very intensive process of going through and auditing the entire 7,500 institutional database in order to get that categorisation.
Any other questions? Well, I've got a question for the 3 of you. So, the title of this session was very strategic. He uses the subtitle, Philanthropy, Partnerships, Markets, which suggests that there is a trajectory. Have you found, I can speak from the perspective of Project Muse, we had 2 countries accessing the Muse journals, Madagascar and Cote d'Ivoire. They participated with Muse for several years, and then as they each became unstable, they couldn't even support the very, very low fees that we were doing. Their higher education structure basically fell apart. So in our experience, it is not a straight pathway from doing good to making money. And I think we were brainstorming at lunch, we each have examples of countries where things haven't always gone straight forward. I think some of the charts that we just saw show some countries are on a flatter trajectory, some go up and then down. You mentioned Egypt specifically. Do you want to talk about other scenarios?
Well, I think Syria is certainly one example that's very obvious, and its categorization has changed in Research for Life, hasn't it, Richard?
Syria, and I think that you have to do that in circumstances like that. But I think there is a hope that there is a hope. Sorry, I wasn't quite sure if you could hear me at the back, but there is a hope that that in some ways, by doing what we're doing, we can actually it's certainly true that events can take a turn for the worse and that things such as Anne has just described can happen. But if we believe that access to scientific research, whether it's actually economics or science or medicine, if we believe that that sort of access is one fundamental tool in nurturing a hopefully upward developmental rise in that country's economy and society, then I think anything we can do to facilitate that is surely going to help to make this a one-way upwards rise in as many situations as we can. I certainly believe that we owe it to the developing country world to make these offers in the hope that that will have some effect. Clearly, we can't always succeed in that, but I feel that it's something that we should do. And I think there is, in some ways, what we're doing is providing that basic knowledge, but that's often not absolutely enough. One of the things I think that can prevent that being just the only solution is that it's one thing to provide the knowledge, but it's another thing to ensure that the political strategists within countries recognise that here is a resource that actually costs money to make use of. In other words, there's no point in offering people the material through which they can do effective research if you don't then fund that research being done. So I think that there is, in addition to providing this content, there is a need to reach out not just to the direct beneficiaries, but to the political strategy makers and so on and so forth, to get that feeling that there is worth in all this in terms of a country's own economic and social development.
From a really practical perspective, though, even though countries go forward and maybe occasionally go a couple of steps back, that volatility shouldn't scare you off of getting started if you want to. Research for Life is a really good first step. If you want your content to be accessible in a wide variety of developing countries, and then you just want to sort of stop worrying about that, do it. If you want to get more engaged, if you're diversifying your partners, if you're working with INASP and some of the others, then it's probably a commitment that you'll need to make that every year or two you'll do a little review about how all of that's going and whether you need to shift the balance of activities for different countries to reflect that volatile situation. But it's totally up to you, whatever suits your organization or your style preferences.
Well, for me, one of the reasons that we started working with INASP is that we wanted to do good things, but we didn't have the manpower to understand every country at the level that you might need to make these decisions, to either differentiate, your sure customers from those who are only on the outskirts of using your content. By letting INASP is my coach, my mentor, and my protector in this. They protect my content. They're much fiercer on abuse monitoring than we are. They say cut them off. We would usually send a couple gentle warnings before we cut somebody off. They tell me if a country can muster a payment or not. They tell me if we should change the pricing to meet the current structures. And if I didn't have them as my mentor and my protector in this program, we couldn't participate at all because we just don't have a big enough staff. So I think, this partner, use as many partners as you need to accomplish what your organization wants, and do as little or as much as you're capable of doing at a given time. We started with INASP several years ago. We had 2 countries. Now I think we have 800 institutions using these, and that our publishers love it. Our editors love it. The authors are so excited to learn that somebody in a country they've never even considered would use their content is using their content. Another program that we participate in, the Iraq Virtual Science Library. However you feel about what the U.S. has done and is doing in Iraq, There also exists one for Afghanistan. Don't punish the scholars for the decisions that happen at a political level. The scholars are still trying to do their work. They're still trying to think the deep thoughts, even though there's a war or instability around them. That's not their fault. Yeah. Go ahead.
It's partly a comment and also a question, because we've been involved for some years with things you've mentioned now in research projects. And the comments we got back from there, because I kept saying, but it's fine, we're on all of these projects, so you should be able to get free access to our journals or the library. So bandwidth and education of librarians are two big problems. And that's why I was asking questions about how you get access through the username and password system, because, to quote one of the guys, please, if you could just give us access through Starbucks, that's the best place. 3/4 of the population have mobile phones, because there is bandwidth out there, but it's not necessarily in the libraries.
That's absolutely true, and more and more we find that you've got that last mile problem, that you've got the big pipe going around the coast of Africa, for example, but the spurs don't go in, and we do find that increasingly the academics that we talk to are actually using VSAT. And actually, they're getting access to Research for Life, they're using a password, but they're not doing it through the institution's own network. This is fine, I think, if you are an academic who can afford that. You're one of these people who's got consultancies and such like. But I do think it is still also essential that we lobby those people who can build that final mile by saying, look at all the content that will be much more easily accessible if you do, that people won't be sort of staying up till 3 a.m. to download that PDF, because that's the only time that they can get it within 2 hours. Yeah.
And to build on that, Research for Life does a tremendous job, and the power and the influence of the UN agency partners is pretty formidable. They can tackle the odd instance of corruption or gatekeepers around passwords who aren't getting those out to the academics, etc., and they do a really terrific job of that. But it's not perfect, and it doesn't meet all of the needs. So again, having multiple partners is interesting if you have the bandwidth for that. So, for example, ICTP and KIT are two programs that work not through libraries, but through subject networks for physicists, for example. And I don't know if there's something like that in mathematics, which is your area, but that can be powerful.
That would be really interesting, because as I said, the people who want to read research paper in Starbucks on a Friday night, they're usually research mathematicians.
So ICTP might be a good partner for you. And I guess the other thing is that when we start working directly under a deeply discounted market model with research-intensive institutions in these countries, we see their usage really, really increase. And you all know what publishers do to make content relevant and accessible, and to help with training and marketing on campus and these sorts of things, and that can make a real difference too if you've got the bandwidth.
And I think that upstream of that, by engaging with Research for Life, it just looking then at the login statistics and your own usage statistics can give you some sort of a steer as to where, if you do want to develop these bilateral relationships yourself, where to focus on.
Janet, did you want to?
Right. Just going back to the point about bandwidth, and I was just thinking of an example when I was in Cameroon a couple of years ago at the University of Buea, and I went to go and talk to the head librarian, and she was explaining that they have 3 different service providers who provide internet access for the university, and the access comes and goes, and they have to toggle between these different providers and move to different parts of the university to try and improve the signal, and it's a constant juggling act. And there's just those sort of issues are very complex. But organisations like INASP and others, including technology partners, are trying to improve those conditions. But there are just multiple issues, and but yes, I think things are improving in many places, but still much more to go.
You had a question like that?
Yeah, this I don't know if we have time for this. It's kind of a pivot question. I really like the message the publishers should get started. This one's really way more basic, but as an association publisher with some really strong book content, when we go to new editions, I have physical printed books that I would like to get to emerging and developing countries, and through some personal stuff that I did with an organization in the U.S. that distributes books that way. It used to be kind of free, and now it's kind of like really expensive. I was curious if you knew of any resources, and maybe this is kind of also a reminder to publishers, if you have previous editions and you would like to physically get those books to worthy markets.
There's one in the US too.
There's Book International in the UK, but you have an equivalent in the US.
The major U.S. distributor shut its doors.
No, but there's a charity that does the distribution of print copies.
International Book Project.
Is it?
IBP? Books for Africa?
Unfortunately, but now it's like U.S. postal rates.
It's the
And
person,
these
we
are
invited
books.
one of them onto this panel.
that was Book Aid International. that we
So
invited.
UK.
Yeah.
If you think of one or no one.
We are kind of talking about journalists here, but both IFL and INASP are working on ebook projects. They're, of course, always limited by the things that Janet was referring to, low bandwidth, electricity, machines, etc. Just a note on the INASP website, if you're a library trying to reach out or a publisher trying to reach out, INASP has a low bandwidth simulator on their website, and you can run your homepage through it, and you might find that some of those bells and whistles are really inhibiting people. Not long ago in Baltimore, I used a dial-up internet account at home, and that's a low bandwidth simulation if you think about it. And a lot of my father who lives in rural Illinois has a pretty low bandwidth situation. So it's not only in the poorest countries of the world. Some of it's in the richest countries in the world. Any other questions? I've got more. Let's do one more. Let's see where it takes us. So challenges, we've all been talking all happy talk, like we're making big differences and having great rewards. What are some of the challenges to making it happen? I know somebody referred to maybe political gatekeepers in a country who don't wish to share that login and password, or lack of trained librarians, or librarians without negotiation skills. What are some of the other challenges you're encountering?
Yes, I think we've covered some of them already, but it's interesting listening to just what you just said just now, because in the survey that we've just been conducting at Research for Life, we didn't overtly ask people to list any challenges, but we did have an open question at the end saying, is there anything else you'd like to say? And that issue of not sharing information did come up with several of the correspondents who complained either that librarians sort of closely guard the username and password and won't share it with anyone. There was also this feeling that sometimes it would only be shared with senior staff and wouldn't trickle down to others. I think this sometimes happens. I mean, as Alicia said, we are at Research for Life very diligent about tracking abuse, and we do cut people off and then say, look, you will need to apply for a new username and password because this one's been compromised. And this can sometimes, unfortunately, have a sort of adverse effect on librarians' willingness to share the thing, and that's not something that we want to happen. I think the other challenge that we at Research for Life feel that we have is that in a lot of cases, the level of information literacy is relatively low, and there's a huge demand for training. In that free form, have we anything else to say section of our survey, the biggest single theme was, we want more training, we want more training, we want more training. And we can only do limited training because we fund the training from the series of $1,000 fees that the slightly better off institutions pay. And that's not enough to cover all the requests for training that we get. So I think there is a challenge there. Now, in some instances, I mean, for example, our chief training organisation in Africa, ITOCA, have just got a Gates Foundation grant to keep them going, and things like that do help. But there's still, nevertheless, far more that we would like to do if we had the resources to do it and go out there. One of the things that we've been very aware of in the past is that because we have limited resources for training, we've tended to make a decision to spread it wider and thinner. And we are coming to see that this isn't necessarily the best strategy, and one of the central planks of our collaborative training project in Sierra Leone within ASP is that we're going to go to the other extreme, as it were, and commit to a 3-year programme of going in there and getting it going and keeping on being in there over 2 or 3 years in a much more intensive way, and to look at after that whether that has had some sort of impact. Because although we wouldn't be able to do that everywhere we'd like to, if we can actually do it and then come back with some definitive evidences of impact, it might allow us to then go to other potential funders to say, this is working very, very well, how about making a contribution to allowing us to extend that.
Did either of you want to respond?
Just to pick up on one point about librarians, which is somewhat very different and possibly a counter to the point that Richard brought up, which I think both exist in different contexts. What I have heard from some librarians, and certainly was the case in Ghana, was the librarians were very actively engaged with e-resources and the opportunities that setups like Research for Life and INASP and IFL had put into place, and were very anxious to get faculty and students using the material, but they found that there was some resistance from some faculty members to take all this on board, and so some of the senior professors, and in some contexts there is a kind of strong hierarchy at work, and some people, perhaps not that keen to sit in a training session or to take time out to learn
from a mere librarian.
From someone who's maybe considered in a sort of stratified social situation, not quite at the same level. So I think there is this divide between faculty and libraries, and in some contexts in different countries.
I think you're right, actually, very right there, Janet. But I do think it's also worth saying, perhaps drawing attention again to our new booklet, Unsung Heroes, which unfortunately is at the moment only available online, which does actually catalogue some wonderful examples where librarians have actually grasped the initiative and done wonderful things and been very, very successful. So there are, and one of the reasons we did this, because we were aware of other instances where this wasn't happening and where there were issues about it happening, and we wanted to provide some really positive exemplars that we could then distribute around, saying, look, this is what can happen if you do it right.
Did you have a challenge?
So I've got a few random challenges. One of them was brought to mind because my colleague Mark Seeley is here, and he's a lawyer, and I can remember last summer having a few weeks of exchanges with him on email, because we couldn't
quite work out the politics of North Sudan and South Sudan and how to get access to information in those two countries. And in the end, we dodged entirely, and we just left it to the UN agencies and Research for Life, because we couldn't figure that one out. I don't guess anybody can really, but so that's a challenge, just the political situation. And sometimes countries like the US or Europe might have concerns about other countries like Iran or North Korea. So you have to be a little bit mindful of the geopolitics, I guess, of the situation. The second challenge is very internal. We have a very consensual organization, so we need kind of cross-organizational support to provide access through one of the philanthropic programs. And it can be a little challenging sometimes to get sales colleagues on board for that. They tend, I've never done sales, but they tend to want to preserve the possibility of selling into a market. And so for the last 2 or 3 years, we've done a lot of internal training and sensitizing, and have shifted the model around. We must provide philanthropic access unless they've got a clear ability to actually effectively get access in, because they are working directly with institutions. And that's been a pretty tough cultural change internally in some ways. The third thing I would say is local level marketing for any of these programs. I don't think that there's any way to feel really confident that every researcher or student on campus has got an awareness of Research for Life, despite all the good effort. And that feels really frustrating sometimes, how we get the comms and marketing out at the grassroots level. Maybe some of you have some good ideas.
It's that way in the wealthy countries too. Students and faculty who don't know that they have research, that they have access to 800 products and 50,000 e-journals.
So how do you guys do that in libraries? Are there some things that we should be learning in some of these philanthropic programs about local marketing and mobilization?
I get a lot of emails. Dear Anne Snowbus, I am in Brazil and my university doesn't have this article. Will you send it to me? Well, dear so-and-so, please talk to your librarian because you have it all and you've had it all for years. Please talk to your librarian.
Yeah, that's very true. And there was a survey done a couple of years ago by Arcadia, wasn't there, sponsored by the Association of Commonwealth Universities, where they actually found that, I think it was the majority of people who said they didn't have access to something actually did.
Yeah.
They just didn't know. And this is a sort of, I think this is a constant, a bit like what we say in the UK, painting the fourth bridge, because you can just about get that knowledge instilled, and then the key person or people leave and they don't hand that information on. To actually keep that awareness, even once you've got it, is actually quite a challenge. But it's interesting. I'm not quite sure how to interpret this, but of the 1,034 people who responded to our survey, 80% had actually heard of Research for Life, and I think it was something like 70% had actually used it. So that there was a sort of reasonably high level of awareness of it in itself, but that doesn't necessarily follow through into an awareness of whether it's available in your institution.
I have a question over there. Yeah.
Slightly complicated thing to say, so it's possible that I might be a little defensive, but I don't mean to be.
Please stand up. Please stand up.
Just a few caveats about that. I'm probably the only publisher here from the Global South.
Yeah.
South Africa, working journalist in previous publishing as well.
Louder.
I do understand. It's an interesting thing. I mean, I think this is half of the story, really. I think, providing access and these initiatives are fantastic, and obviously success stories, people rely on it and use it. But I think there's another part of this, which is instead of talking about these places, you should be talking with them. So it would be nice to have publishers and librarians from there, not being subject to, and this is where the offence begged is, but it would be nice to have them not subject to the gates, so to speak, I think there's the access is essential to have these programs. It's absolutely good to grow, but this shouldn't only be a philanthropic exercise. Neither should it be a market to a car. We should be looking for a proper partnership, which means you have to allow these people to control. So access is great. I think, and I'm not speaking for everyone, I'm speaking for myself and for my organization, possibly a large number of people in my country who want to have that control. So I think what you are going to see, this is something that, organizations such as this should is a more robust approach for people.
Well, I'm going to take your question and spin it into one of the things we did want to touch on, which is what are we doing about local research and what are we doing about locally published materials? You're right, this is very much a north to south, please receive our bounty and be appropriately grateful, right? But the other issue... Right, so what are we doing collectively to help? We talked about author submissions. That's a piece of it. But what about, and I think, Janet, you're committed to the African publishing.
Right. Well, I think I'm glad you used very valid contribution, Andrew. And I think the term in the middle of that subtitle of the title of the talk, partnerships, is where the focus is and should be, because it's very much a dialogue and working together. And in just thinking about the Publishers for Development initiative, it's very much it has strong voices from the South, and it's not just a bunch of Northerners getting together to talk about the issues. They are representatives, librarians, publishers, societies, institutions from the global South who do make their voices heard and who do challenge and who are provocative and do make us all think, and we do change our minds about things, so I think I think we need more of that. But in terms of there's been a lot of focus on access, but I think what you're also referring to is the circulation of knowledge from the South and the contribution that scholarship from various developing and emerging countries is making. And I think we all recognize that that the world is changing, and there needs to be more participation.
I want to just chime in quickly with one happy story. Project Muse brought the African Books Collective into our book programs last year, and we sold books to Zimbabwe and Ghana. And African Books Collective told us that they had had a lot of trouble getting their books into other parts of Africa because of VAT, because of customs, because of shipping, issues like that, that only through the Project Muse and our in-house participation were they actually getting readers in the places where they wanted the readers, which was in Africa. So sometimes I think you do have to take a circuitous route to make things happen.
So a couple of things I'm aware of, and then a question for you, if that would be okay. So we have publishing partnerships that are quite interesting, usually for open access journals that are published by organizations in a wide variety of countries that have local or regional impact and significance. And often the owners of those journals are interested in raising international awareness and profile for their journals. So they'll partner with a variety of publishers, not just Elsevier, to help make that happen. And we provide training and support, but they continue to own their journals. They have complete control over the selection of content to be published in them, and et cetera. So that, I think that's a nice form of partnership. The other thing I'm aware of is the World Intellectual Property Organization right now is working through the International Publishers Association and with local trade associations in, I think it's 7 countries, mostly sub-Saharan Africa and Sri Lanka at the minute. But they're trying to put in place local training programs for publishers, particularly in how to produce ebooks and to market those internationally. And that's quite interesting because the local trade associations provide this powerful voice that amplifies local needs. But really, from your perspective, I don't know where you're from or anything else, but what would be helpful? What could and should we all be doing to support local publishing, do you think?
Wow, so I'm speaking for everyone.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, speaking. So I'm working at the University of West. We don't consider ourselves developing.
Right, okay.
It's a proposition. Yeah, I think what would be interesting, particularly for the scholarly press, is I can't really speak also trade stuff and education world. But I think what would be interesting is for our authors to publish with us, people based on us to publish with us, for our work to have the same prominence and reach that yours. And that's as much our doing as our not doing as yours. I think we have to up the game substantially. But I think some sort of understanding of how that's going to work, how that part is going. Because we don't necessarily have as a robust business plan as a TNF, but we do have some. So we should work on who's part of the neighborhood, who's something like that. I don't know, some sort of understanding about that. The other thing would be distribution. It's very complicated with South African libraries, particularly in that they buy from international consortia. So what we're finding is people are buying directly we have people buying books from international consortia that we send through to distributors in the States, and that comes back. It's a very messy sort of thing. Partly, again, it's our thing to fix up as well. We need to be a little more certain of those things. But I think if we could just have almost some sort of bilateral arrangement about these, a sense of, I don't want to say propriety, but some sense of clear rules. Because we can't take someone on this community. It's exactly the same thing that we can just make the universal process. But that's our challenge. So I mean, rather than kind of sort of fly away and filter down to us, which I'm not knocking the wall. I think it's brilliant. We'd like to come at it from another angle as well and say, well, maybe it should start here.
So, I'm sorry, it's 3 o'clock. I have to race off to the airport. I invite you to continue talking with our panelists, and please email and tweet with us, about us. I think it's been a great panel. I really appreciate that these 3 came with their diverse perspectives.
And do help us.